Up to a few years ago, I didn't understand how to add the light sources and especially where to add them in order to make better or cinematic scenes. I was always using the same light position and rendering way, but not understanding why it worked. This led me to sometimes being inconsistent with the light and having problems when I wanted to add more light sources. I really wanted to create cinematic scenes or just improve in general my light positions for the story or a scene, so I thought, where can I learn for making better cinematic scenes? Well, the obvious answer was movies. In order to create much interesting scenes or portraits or illustrations is to think as if it is a movie scene. I'll be explaining you guys a few things I learned from movies before starting with the way I think for adding light and shadows in my inking illustrations. A general rule that movies applies is to always shoot the scene from the shadow side of the character, helping this to bring much more volume and better mood to the scenes, which leads me to the second point. Very often there are three types of light sources that are almost always used in movies. I will use some 3D renders to explain it much better, and later we will see how it translates into inked drawings. The first light is a key light, which is the light that will cover the most the character. Generally it's the strongest light and often placed in the front sides of the character to create a nice shadow to bring more volume. Usually looking for the Rembrandt light, which gives a little triangle in the face. Then there is the fill light, which will take care of filling with light the shadow sides to avoid making it too dark. Something important is that this light should be on the other side of the key light, pointing towards the shadow, and the light strength should also be lower than the key light, so we can still keep the shadows that brings volume to the character. This light does not create any casted shadow. And lastly we have the backlight. This light is generally for separating the character from the background, which in most cases is what creates a rim light, placing it generally at a 45-degree angle at the back and a bit higher than the character. Now, since we are looking for that cinematic look, there are a few positions of the light that I will use most of the time. There are more ways to set up the light, but I will generally try to aim for three types of setups. Usually I will place the light from the top front left, from the top front right, or sometimes I would use just a backlight. A light from below is for more specific situations, mostly for dramatic scenes or maybe for horror type of scenes. In general, I would try to avoid a light from the front unless it is necessary for the scene or composition, since this tends to give a much flat appearance to the face. Now in comics there are a few ways to render your characters. Maybe you could prefer using really heavy shadows with no backlight or fill light, having only one light source, which is the key light, and the shadow will cover most of the face in black. There's also others that prefer adding a backlight or a rim light with no midtones or fill light, having only two light sources, the key light and the backlight. This still blocks most of the face in black, but giving some space for a second light source. And lastly, there is other one used with gray tones, which will serve as a fill light, often for a much cleaner type of style, especially useful to give some space for the colors to add more volume, other colors to the fill light, and also add a third light source to give that sweet rim light. I would generally jump around between these rendering ways depending on the type of story. Since the first two are much darker, these are much more useful for detective, horror or dramatic type of story, in contrary to the last one, which is a much cleaner style, but also can be a much more balanced way of rendering your figures for any kind of story. Now, how do we use this knowledge into our black and white work for comics or manga? I'm going to use a panel I'm working on for my comic as an example. As said before, we place first our key light, but since we are working in black and white, we can't really draw the light. So we will create the shadows that the key light gives. Let's place the light on the top front right of the character. When placing the shadows, always keep in mind from where it is coming the light and how it affects the volume of the figure. Remember that one of the main ideas of the key light is to bring volume, so use that in your advantage. Generally, when drawing shadows, I tend to go for straight lines and sharp corners to show the volume, but this is just mostly an stylistic choice. Once I got the grays for the shadows, I will start adding some black spots or hatching between the shadows and the light. This is to create the effect of the fill light. Most of the hatching or the cross hatching will be inside of the gray tones, following the form of the volume, but sometimes I will go outside of it just to make a much smoother transition. You can use the Magic Wand tool to select the gray tones and start adding the hatching details inside of it without going out of it. And later on you can add some extra hatching details to smooth the shadow transition. I try to keep in mind all times where the fill light is coming from, so the shadows should follow the direction of it. Just in case, this is not the only way to render things out. As said before, it really depends on what you're looking for on the scene and with your style. So take this just as another tool to think how to shade your characters. This is just the way it helped me out the most for understanding light positions and storytelling with light. That would be it for today's video. I really hope this video was helpful in the end and I learned a few new things onto how placing the light works, so you can make your characters look cinematic to enhance your comics or any kind of illustration. That being said, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you on the next video. Bye!